Make sure that we're on the air.
Oh, we're good.
Yes?
Should be, yeah. Yes.
Welcome to the review shir of Parshat Hayei Sara, Tafshin Ayin Vav. So what we have in front of us is clearly a transitional parsha, because it's a little bit strange when you consider that the words before Hayei Sara essentially announces the story of the birth of Milka Gami Yoda Banim Lenochar Achicha, and we get out with Betuel Yaladet Rivka, and then we open up basically Toldot with going back to that beginning. Vela Toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham, Yitzchak ben Arba'im Shana Bekachtot Rivka Bat Betuel Arami. I mean, basically all the things that happen in the middle. Why are they a parsha unto themselves? The parts that have to do with the death of Sara that was related to the Akedah, and that's the whole story. Lamanismaka Parshat Sara, Mitat Sara, the Parshat Akedah, is all the various midrashim that link these stories of what happened at the end of the Akedah, the way in which the neshama of Rivka was connected to Hayei Sara because of the Akedah. However, one understands, we've discussed it in the past, understand that whole first part of the burial of Sara and the hesped on Sara and so on, that belongs together with the Akedah. And then the whole part, very, very long part, about the story of how it is that Yitzchak comes to take Rivka, fits in perfectly well in Eila told Yitzchak and Avraham, which instead of simply repeating it, saying how old he was, Bikachto, we could say, this is how he was a Kachto, and ended with Yitzchak ben Arba'im Shana, Vayisatei Nav Vayar, and that was the whole. I mean, the fact that this is somehow links those two inyonim as if it's a parsha b'fnei atzma, means that this is transitional between the story of the way in which Avram Avinu is linked to Midas Hadin, and that transition goes into, in the end, the story of Yitzchak somehow. And when we talk about the transition, I mean, it's clear even biologically as a transition, because it's sort of like finishing everything up. I mean, we're treated over here to 2 weddings and 3 funerals in the course of one parsha. And those are, on any level, in any society, those are very profound transitions. And it fits, and it would be transitional, but we need to define what these transitions are. And in fact, I think that we will find that in defining the transitions, we find that these transitions are indeed defining transitions. And in a very fundamental way, the entire focus of the Torah undergoes intense changes in the transition of Hayei Sara, and it's remarkable that it's not immediately evident to people. And we will see there are 12 fundamental transitions in the parsha that change irrevocably the entire development of Torah from this point on, and also our relationship through the parsha to the past, not only to the future. So let's take a look at the first transition, which the Zohar traces. This is a transition that is so fundamental that it actually changes the name of who created the earth, because we have 2 stories of the creation of the earth, right? So the way the Zohar puts it is, and we were asking, so what's the transition? We already had Vayelchu Shneim Yaakov, which means that Avram Avinu had been joined to Yitzchak Avinu's din, and that seems to be about the size of it, the size of the transition. That's what we needed, right? We needed to go from Chesed into Din, and obviously that was a transitional phase in which Avram Avinu had to be nitnaseh about that. Was he capable of absorbing Din? And that, indeed, the Zohar said last week, is why we don't talk about it as being the Nisayin to Yitzchak, it's the Nisayin to Avram, because Avram needs to be mechubar now from all of his chasadim We went through this, how what an amazing change it is, how painful it was for Avram, and so on, and how it is that it redefines the original Lech Lech, all the things that we discussed last week. But what more is there to add? So the Zohar, there's everything to add. Because up until this time, it's true that we were Mechaber Avraham to Din, but we've never been Mechaber Yitzchak to Chesed. The whole idea of this parasha in terms of Vayitain, Avram gives Kol Asher Lo Yitzchak. That Kol Asher Lo, says the Zohar, is his own midas, the way in which he had developed his life, and which in the end, as we'll see, is even the reason why Yitzchak rediscovers Sara in the guise of his own wife, in the Vayirachem Acharei Imo, because the Zohar says rather shockingly, because Avram also gave over Sara to Yitzchak. So that the discovery of what it would be to have a wife that has those simonim, the shlosha simonim, and the level of tzidkes, and of course as the Zohar points out, the Rabbeinu Bachya makes it very clear that that's why he even says the reason that it says Lama Nisbechat Parshas Ha'akeda to the death of Sara, he says that's not even true. What happened to the Parsha Vayachri Advorim Eila in the middle? So he says, so, you see, Torah is taken for granted that Rivka is Sara. And that, of course, is a remiss to the whole idea. I mean, he doesn't say this openly, but he says, but there are Sodos that are very Yikorim, that are Merumas here, in terms of you have the Yetzira and Maisa Bereshis, and that's what the Smichas have to say. And again, this was spoken about in the past. I'm just doing sort of like a brief review of that. So the idea is that the concept of identity and its relationship to what we call the neshama, or we've spoken about the way in which that became this esoteric idea of Gilgal neshamas, which to us is very, very easy to put into modern terms and to understand completely as the nature of various matrices that can hold the same information. It will give you the sense that you're talking to the same person, even though now he may be preserved in silicon. That makes absolutely no difference. You know, we can understand there's a concept of downloading a totality that we call a mind. If we had enough technology and we had the proper matrices, it wouldn't be strange to us at all at this point. So that indeed, this is one of the transitional libudim. So clearly, we have this whole new idea, says the Zohar. That idea is such an important change that it's the reason that in the story of Bereshit, we have two stories of Bereshit. First, we have Bereshit Bara Elohim, which is Midas Hadin, and then we have Eila Tolda Shemayim V'Aretz B'Yom Baros Hashem Elokim Eretz V'Shamayim, in which the Nida of Hashem, which is Meramis to Avram's, which this becomes Bihi Baram in terms of the Toldos Adam Bihi Baram. That's like a whole different Bria, because now it's Hashem Elokim. It's as if somebody else created the world. That is created here, where there's the dveikus of the concept of the Shem Hashem to the Elohim, and that is the Hakadama of Chesed to Gevura. And that is something that had to happen before Yitzchak was able to create Toldos, because that's the Eila Toldos Shemayim V'Aretz B'Baram. As we pointed out in the past, that indeed not only is the creation of Toldos, but it supplies the missing Vav in the Toldos. So that the idea of the Ve'ela Toldos is now, for the first time, a real chibur of the way Maisa Bereshis was initially, but the way Maisa Bereshis plays out. And we shall see how profoundly true that is when we examine some of the other transitions that are so much part of our parsha. Okay, so that's a transition which is merumas in the Torah itself, and that the Zohar points out. There are other transitions that are equally fundamental. And although they're not as clear in terms of the specific mafarish explaining it, once we see it, it's clear that that's what happened. And indeed, the Mefarshim are meramis to this change. And that is the change from innocence to complexity. Basically, up until this point of the Torah, we have what Tzedek Cohen calls the childhood of Yisrael. the childhood of humanity, essentially. So that and that's why that's why we talk about Zrizu Seder Avram. Why do we look specifically to Avram as the Zariz? Because he's the child, so to speak, the beginning. The beginning is always, people are always excited. So before a revolution goes sour, everybody's happy. And then, okay, fine. Afterwards, the complexity set in, and now you have to be a true believer, and now you start killing people, and because nothing makes sense. Once it doesn't make sense, it has to be imposed. And, okay, but the early years, what's remarkable is in these early years, it is so innocent that the idea of Avram's innocence becomes the essence of his development. Because remember, the Rabbeinu Bach explained that the Tmimus of Noach was the given that came before the Yisalech Noach, right? Tzaddik, Tamim Haya B'Dor. That's always the nature of development. Tzaddik to Tamim to Mitalech. But by Avram Avinu, it says Yitalech Lefanai Vayei Tamim, which means that the level of Tmimut is something that was discovered as something entirely new. And of course, as we spoke about last week, is part of what the Rambam calls, what Mishlei refers to, the state of holistic Chachma. And that's the Chachamim Bechukamim, in which someone who is Tamim in his dad does not allow things that don't fit. Because Tamim means that things need to fit into a framework that is kolel everything. And if there's something, and that is, again, these are ideas we spoke about so many times. That's the reason that science works. The reason that we know the difference between quacks and serious science is by that question. Does it fit completely and totally and comfortably into the entire structure that we've discovered, such that each piece fits holistically with every other piece? The moment something is just there ad hoc, something is terribly wrong. How could you stick in something ad hoc? What provided for it? That level of Tmimus is a totzah of the shleimus of Avram Avinu and his willingness to never be satisfied with any gods of gaps or anything else. He's always searching for a fundamental description of reality. But part of that fundamental description, as we saw, was an unbelievable Tmimus in accepting nature as it is, which was shaken initially by Bris Milah. And here, in the closing chapter of his life, is almost shocking in its power, because Lamaisa, we're talking about Avram and Sara that had all of these haftachas, 5 different places in which there's haftacha, on the Bonim and on Yerushas Haaretz, and unbelievably, as the Kadosh Baruch Hu points out later, Vayal Da'avdin, he died with nothing, not even with a grandchild. He wanted to have some connection to Eretz Yisrael after all these haftachas. Pay through your nose. It's like unbelievable. Isn't there any sense of, is this ever really going to happen? No. Not only that, Zaken, Saveya, he's happy, he's fulfilled, he senses everything is great. I mean, anybody else in this kind of situation who went through the things that he went through would be sitting around in an old age home screaming at everyone that passed by. This is Zaken Saveya. It's an amazing madriga. Beginning after the death of Avram, we realize, but wait, that was part of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu was maftiach. HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised him that you will die b'seiva tovah. That b'seiva tovah means you will be happy. You won't see. Even though you know what's coming, you won't see what's coming. But from this moment on, it's clear that after that, but then starts the Geri Hazracha, Beretz Lo Lahem, and with all that implies with the Ema Chashecha, Gedolah, the Nefelet, and the problems and the complexities that are there in order to be mevar the reality of Yisrael, and to, in the end, actually take them down to a refiner's furnace. And that's the idea of that the HaKadosh Baruch Hu brings us into the refinery. And we go through Mitzrayim, we go through the Goliath, so that each and every one of these tremendous national events are changes in the national identity and the clarity of what our mokum is in terms of Avodat Shamayim. So this too is a tremendously new area. And it's a new area that brings us to another transition because it's an area that men cannot handle. Only women can handle. If you take a look from this point of the story, of this difficult period, which goes until HaChodesh HaZelachem, essentially, because this is the period of development. So the Koach Ma'asav Yigid B'Yamo Latet Lem Nachalat Goyim is a period which we figure, okay, that's about the development of humanity. All of a sudden, it's about men not knowing anything, starting already with Rivka. To such an extent that the Medrash says Rivka didn't even want to be Meshatef Yitzchak in the whole issue about Shnei Goyim and so on. Because he would just throw his hands up and say, it'll work itself out. And she had to be the one that manipulated things. Of course, this leads to the whole idea of Rama'ut and the incorporation of Ramut and the family of Lavan, which is upcoming in the parshas to come, very powerfully. And that Rama'ut is almost by definition complexity, where things are seldom what they seem, where skim milk masquerades as cream. And this is exactly what's going on from this point forward. So Rivka doesn't share that with Yitzchak. And the truth is, everything that is going on in the background, all the way through the men not being able to handle the events in Mitzrayim. Amad v'gira shetishto amdu kulam v'girshu et nishotehem. Amram, Gadol Hador, Sanhedrin, everybody that's with them. 5-year-old little girl. Abba? Yeah, what is it? Okay. Vayelech ish beit levi ma halach batzad pito. Damn, she's right. Okay, and then everything. I mean, it's a bischut b'shim tzidkanios. It's the story of whether it's Bitya or whether it's the story of Miriam and Yocheved and everyone that was involved all the way through Sara Bat Asher and the changes with getting out of Mitzrayim and really starting earlier already with the Benot Lot, who had a vision of Zera Acher, which the Medrash says is really the Zera of root. And its murum isn't shaped, and that becomes Tachas Kayin Kiaraba, which is the tikkun of the Shivatayim Yukam Kayin, which is Shvuas and Kabbalah Satera and the Kotamar LaBeit Yaakov, and a million things, all of which are completely interwoven with the presence of various women. And that's exactly what happens over here. It's to such an extent that the idea of the whole future is amazing how the Navi defines it, which is that the Isha, Yaakov was Yered B'Isha Shamar, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yisrael was in Mitzrayim, B'Navi Shamar, obviously the same thing. What does one have to do with the other at all? That's what we read ultimately the Haftarah by Mitzrayim. So it's clear that the Torah is being miramis to us at various levels. And that's the whole story of the development of Yisrael with Yaakov and his wives and the intrigue that's going on between the Nashim and the Dudayim and all of those other developments. It's an amazing transition. And it's not merely a transition in the focus, whether the focus is on men or on women, but this leads us to the next level of transition. It's a transition in the relationship to women. In other words, up until this time, we had completely paternalistic relationships. And there was no mention of love of a woman ever until this parsha. We had the types of relationships in which there's a tremendous amount of resentment. The chamasi alecha, the bossing around, we'll give you over to Avimelech, and so on and so forth. All of a sudden now, we go from paternalistic relationships to love to such an extent, by the way, it seems like, oh, this is like this conceptual analysis to such an extent, amazingly, types of minhagim that existed in the depths of their perception. So Rabbeinu Bachya brings this brought in other places as well, how they used to do this. Now, Rabbeinu Bachya brings that the minhag in many kihilahs would be, if they had a Shabbat Chatan, that they would read Hayei Sara. And there's other places that say after they finish the Parshat HaShavua, they would go to the Sefer Torah, take out Parshat Hayei Sara, and they would read Hayei Sara.
From where?
What do you mean from where? It's
What Parsha?
the part, this part of Hayei Sara, the part up until Rivka, I'm assuming, but because that's where you have it for the first time, the recognition of what Sara was worth, and the hesped on Sara, and the bracha about Sara, the Yeshes Chayil, and the Remes, Hashem Berachot, and so it was ad kedei kach that they were aware of these changes, that they wanted Chatanim to learn how to deal with the marriage. And the way that they would learn would be only by getting past the opening stories of the Torah. So, and that, it's brought out so amazingly, that this is the first time that the Medrash tells us that Avram really recognized Sarah. To such an extent when HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to Baruch Avraham Bakol, so one of the man the Amram, what is the bracha Bakol? Shahayalo Eshes Chayil. She's already dead. But that's the point, that he never really fully related to what that meant until now. This is amazing. And then the Medrash that says that the whole Parsha Mishlei Eshes Chayil was actually written by Avram Avinu. Amazing transition. It's really crazy from his taking Hagar, and the whole unhappiness with Hagar and treating her better than Sarah, the way Sarah felt. And Yitzchak, who was dealing with the same problem of infertility, in which L'nochach Ishto Chazal means that he said as part of his tefillah, I don't want any other woman. I don't want to have children with any other woman. I want to have children from this woman. My God, for Avram Avinu, the arguments that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had with Avram about that, the Lu Yishmo Yechiel Lefanecha, the Lashon Medrash, don't you know the difference between the Shifcha and the Isha? And this is Sara Ishtecha, and that's how it begins. It's Sara Ishto. It's exactly how the Parsha begins over here, which until now was an argument. These are very, very profound differences. And indeed, as the Zohar explains, the nature of that love can only come after the discovery of Yitzchak. Why? Because that interrelationship, which Yitzchak is zoche to hear, which is the getter of Hashem Elokim in terms of Ma'aser Bereishis, is expressed beautifully in the pasuk of Smolot Tachat Roshi v'Yiminot Techat Keli. So, small is always din. Yimino is always chesed. And that, says the Zohar, is the secret of the new relationship and the love that's here. If you can support your lover's head, so to speak, the small, which implies that there's a complete understanding of the uniqueness of the other. It has its mokum in din. It's defined as something that isn't you. And therefore you support your lover's head, so to speak. That's your mind, your perceptions, your uniqueness. Then Yeminot Techat brilliant song. Right? It's only once you have Yitzchak that it's possible to even conceive of this movement away from the ideas of chesed with all of its destructiveness, in which it's always my chesed and my vision of the world, and my giving to the world, am I caring about the world, am I loving the world, which ends up becoming, God help us, Christian love, and and murdering 100 million people, all in the wonderful name of love and kindness. And this is exactly what happens to it. And that was expressed so strongly in the paternalism of these relationships. The power of the Ava that appears over years, like the clarity that he has. It's not about me, it's about having a child with her. That's what I want. That's the only thing that I want. From that comes even the ideas of love making. Misachek is the Lashon of Yitzchak, Misachek et Rivka Ishto, which Avimelech was smart enough to realize is going to be part of the whole Chiddush of Yitzchak. You know, the idea that he's going to catch Yitzchak making love, you know, and thereby prove that she wasn't really, I mean, he does have sort of grounds to believe that, but he couldn't be stupid enough to try that whole trick again, could he? But in the end, indeed, he catches him making love specifically, and that's because he understands that that's mamish that it could have. And I mean, the ultimate women's liber, so to speak, is Esther Amalka, right? She's the one who bosses her husband around. She's the one who ends up bossing Mordechai around. The whole paternalism, and that's almost the whole story of Purim, is the unbelievable bizui of the relationship initially, in which the only reason he chooses Esther is because she will go along with whatever he wants. You know? So, yes, whatever they tell her, that's what Esther says. That's what I want. Anyway, you tell me, what should I do? What act do I put on? What song should I sing? I have no personal insight at all. The incredible turnaround that happens at the end of that story, the terror that she inspires, whether it's in terms of her husband or it's the chachomim and being mitzvah with them, and Mordechai starts off with being mitzvah for her, and kasher tabom nayito, and now in the end she's giving the orders left and right, sending Daniel out. Now you listen here. It's an amazing story, and she comes from Sara, says the Gemara, unbelievably. The Zohar points out there's never a case of our counting the years of a woman's life in Tanakh, except here. So this little drasha that when you read the Gemara, it sounds like, well, you know, we try to think of something to wake up the Talmidim because they're nodding off. The Rabbi Akiva says, Ma'arata is Sara. Right, the Ma'arata is there to be Molech Hamea 27 Medinot. Sara Chaya 127 Shanim. What? Boing. Everybody wakes up. But says the Zohar, it's not boing. This is serious stuff. Why indeed did the Torah put it there? So that means whatever transition, I mean, that brings out the fact that however we understand it, the point isn't to understand it right now, but the point is to note that that means that we find here in the Gemara the roots of the most powerful changes in the relationships with Isha that go out throughout all of the Deiros. So that as much as the elements of Purim are Nagea, the wine, women, song, the relationship of Ish Isha, nakedness, all the Yinyanim of Begadim, and all of those things that showed up initially in Gan Eden are clearly meant to be a transition in terms of V'hu Yimshavach, which is a straight out klal of Gan Eden in the breakdown of relationships. That was being addressed there, and it's so unbelievably fundamental there in terms of the relationship to Tohu and to Mikra and so on. That means that the source of it all is unbelievable here, which must be the reason that the entire concept of a state that exists between man and woman, a state that we have of a state of Kedushin, as the Rambam describes it. Originally, boy meets girl. Boy bops girl overhead, grab woman. But imratzai, who, he, you know, by consent, fine, they're married. You know, what does married mean? We're shacking up together. That's what marriage means. Why? Because there's no concept of married. What is married supposed to mean? It's a silly idea. It's some justice of the peace signed off that all of a sudden sex is mutter. Now, who asked it? The whole notion is this absurd import from the Torah, which when you don't understand what it's about, it's like, whoa. It's never fully analyzed and it's never fully understood. Which is why, I mean, it's unbelievable, the crazy debates over homosexual marriage and so on. I mean, they have no concept of any marriage. Like, what are they dealing with heterosexual marriage that they're going to come down to discuss? I mean, it's beyond belief. You see this amazing guy in Yale who analyzes this. It says, like, what is the state's stake in marriage? And why in the world should a state be involved in the relationship between people? You know, so he explains, okay, because the state has, in terms of the idea of reproduction, it has a stake, because ultimately the citizens are going to be produced by these marriages, and therefore there's definitely a stake in protecting and providing and making sure that children have a safe home and that there's tax benefits and whatever it is. That makes sense. None of that makes sense for the concept of marriage, right? Okay, but we're not talking about those kind of things here. We're talking about an amazing development of Kicha Mistei Ephron that teaches us that there is such a thing as the creation of a state which is then binding in the most insane ways, and it's connected to Hegdesh, it's connected to creating Yisurim through Nidrei Hegdesh and so on. Wow. Who ever heard until this moment that there was such a thing as a state of relationship of a human being to his property? Also never existed. You owned property, that's all. It had to do with kivush in the mechanical sense, completely. If you control it, however you control it, so it's yours. The idea that hand in hand with the nature of a relationship to a new state called marriage, in which two of you are bound with something else, and that becomes, in the end, we see throughout the Parsha Seita, that becomes the Shem Hashem that's between you, and that it becomes the Me'ilah and the bris that you have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if you're bogate in your marriage and so on. It's an enormously important thing which defines the whole nature of the Beis HaMikdash, and the way in which Rakar the Shittim, which goes all the way back to Ma'aseh Bereshis and so on. It's an unbelievable thing, which is triggered here, of course, by Yiska, who is Sukkos. That's the mocker of Sukkos. We'll see how central that is with an understanding of the transitions as we go along. But again, because we're so used to it, we fail to appreciate what a revolution it is. Mamash, a revolution. All of a sudden, so now we own. The relationship of Kicha Mistei Ephron is as much a Kiddush to Stei Ephron as it is to Isha. That becomes now our boy in Yom Kodim Yitziras Avlad, Isha Ploni Leploni Eshet, Sara Ploni Leploni. It's part of what you are. This is so amazing a concept of a state that there are those poskim who paskin that if a ger is tevel, his kalim don't need tefillah. Because in his tefillah, they were all tovel, because they're just expressions of him. This becomes expressed later on in the Chamor of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yoyer and Rabbi Chanina ben Deisa, and the way in which a person's property are literally expressions of himself, which gets translated into the whole idea of Mammon HaMazik particularly, as opposed to Grum of Hezek, because you have something. If it wouldn't be Mammon and so on, right? Completely different concepts, difference between bor and things that are really yours, the moment, but the Torah has to make it as if it's your moment. But the idea that otherwise it would be a grama means there would be no baba kama. These things are like, it's absolutely astonishing. So this becomes the mocker, not simply of the way in which I think about the relationship, but it's the way in which the legal definition of the relationship. We think that's okay. It happens to be that, we needed a place to bury Sara. So meanwhile, we learn out Kicha Mistei Ephron. My God. I mean, consider what we're talking about over here. The profound relationship, which clearly goes all the way back to Gan Eden, of Ephron particularly being offer, which of course tells us right away, which is exactly what he's buying this for, which is Kura. The story begins with Ella Bakar Ratz Avraham, who runs in and accidentally bumps into this Moras HaMachpelah, which is clearly the place for Kfura, which just coincidentally happens to be the Osios of El HaBakar, which is El HaKever Ratz Avraham. And then out of which he ends up learning how to make a kinyan of an Isha called Rivka, which spells Kfura, in the same parasha, which leads us to all of the unbelievable dinim that are directly one against the other. Sheva brachas for a mace, Sheva brachas for an oval, Sheva brachas for a kala, panim chadoshes for Sheva brachas for a mace, somebody who wasn't at the Avelis yet, so we make the brachas. It's literally the same words, panim chadoshes. Panim chadoshes for the kala. All of the sugyas in the Gemara, which one goes first, if the Levian meets up with a wedding procession, like weird kind of things. I mean, these are not small interrelationships. Go back to the nature of our original understanding of what the Yitziras Havlad means. It means the Tzura of the individual in Olam Hazeh in terms of all its interconnectedness. It really begins here. And we have no concept of it. It's what you can't even say. In any language that I know of, you cannot say the word chal. It's the weirdest thing. There's no concept of chalot. So they try to duplicate it with the word state, because that means something. So it's like a state of war exists between. And that already means that we're not saying what we'll do, but you understand what that involves. It's open-ended, but it is a state of war. But the profundity of creating a state with an act that builds a chalos, I don't know. They don't know what you're talking about. You tell this, right? So just write it down or agree or whatever. I mean, no. Well, what do you mean? But it said, yeah, but he wasn't Gomer Kinyan. He wasn't what? Gomer Kinyan, No, I don't know. What are you talking about?
What makes that different?
It means that we relate to things in an existential sense instead of just memshola, instead of bossing them around.
See a state of war. What's the difference between the state of war?
It's the creation of the state, not the acknowledgement of a state. The halos is to create a state. There's no concept like that. You just don't create states. You just mechanically do the things that you need to do. So now you've made it legal that these two people are defined as married, whatever that means. Here it means something totally, totally different, right? Which is reflected in another transition, and that is the opening, which talks about Kiryat Arba. The Kiryat Arba Yikavron, that's one of the most amazing things, because the Kiryat Arba Yikavron is itself the most profound expression of this change. It specifically was initially the place of the Arba, the Refidim, giants, Anokim, right? One of the types of giants. And it now becomes, and who are those Refidim, remember? The ones who view marriage or sexual relationships in general as being something that you are kodesh. Like Chulem Nashim Mikol Asher Bacharu. It made no difference to them. So you take what you want in this world. The change from Arba, the feeling, to Arba Zugot is just beyond belief. It's like the exact opposite. It's a revolution. We kick them out and we replace it with an idea called Zugyut in modern Hebrew, but that's the Arba Zugot is based on the Gemara is here. The Arba Zugot Akfurim Sham. The Arba Gvurot, the Arba Zugot Akfurim Sham are marumas in the subtext throughout the parsha of the change in the only surviving member of the Refidim after the Mabul. This is Eliezer of Avram. I mean, this is an unbelievable development. It talks of Eliezer of Avram, but He was the guy that originally starts the war in terms of Avram Avinu. Vayavo Apalit ve'aged la'Avram ha'ivri. Where was the Vayavo Apalit? And where did Avram go from? Unbelievable. So the Medrash says, from Kiryat Arba. Because Kiryat Arba provided the entire energy for Avram's war against the Rephidim. So he was coming as one of them because he wanted to take Sara. So he loved Sara the way a Rephidim loves Sara. You know.
Rephaim, no?
What?
Rephaim?
Yeah, what did I say?
Rephidim.
Same thing, Rephaim, Rephidim, Anakim, all of these different names. The Psukim go through all the different names. Yeah. So he's the one. It's true. It's Biyetar Rephaim is the Lashon name. Right. So the transformation in this person throughout the story here is absolutely mind-boggling, because the original remez to Eli, that the Medrash says, yes, indeed, it's all sheker, it's all everything that they do, these Rephaim, it's all done, you can be certain there's not an ounce of truth in it. He's saying, maybe she won't want to come. So obviously it's all big manipulated, it should come to him. He always wanted to take over everything and so on and so forth. I mean, the unbelievable sense of the transition, which comes out of the whole discussion, remember, again, I mean, we've done this before, so I don't want to go, I don't want to go into the details, but if you look at the changes that he makes in the story between his actual meeting with her and what he tells the parents and brothers about how he met her, there's only one explanation for what he did, because he violated his own terms. He didn't wait to find out who she was. He went ahead and he did something when he obviously couldn't say that to them. I mean, so you think he couldn't say it to them because they would say you're stupid. No, he couldn't say it to them because of what it implied. Why did he do it? Remember that it says, Vayish Mishta'ela. What is Mishta'ela? He's waiting. It's just another minute. I'm soon going to know whether I was successful or not. But you don't wait that minute. You go and you give her the Kiddushin, and then you say, and who are you? What is that supposed to mean? So why indeed did he do that? That we understood was the most amazing awareness on his part of the nature of Gemilas Chasad. That because of the fact that she went beyond what he said, she said, Al asher im kimu lishtot. I'm going to see to it there are no strings attached. You won't have to come back for another drink. You're refueled and ready to go. You want to stay and something comes from this relationship, fine. No, it's all yours. It's an amazing thing. Of course, that's the whole nature of Gemilut Chasadim, which relates to camels, as we've said. You can only be a camel in Chasadim, which is to be Gomel, which is why the Gemilah of Yitzchak is so central, because otherwise, again, it's manipulation and memshalah. It's basically Rephaim-oriented instead of relationship-oriented. When the woman tells you no strings attached, what are you going to do? You're going to turn to her. I just have a couple of questions. It's impossible. You can't do that. It's exactly the same, which relates very profoundly to this parsha as well, as we'll see through the Haftarah. It's exactly the same as Ruth throwing herself onto Boaz, and people say, so why did Boaz say stay the night? I mean, what after is there to stay the night? And what are you supposed to say? You might as well shoot her through the head. What are you supposed to say? Why don't you go back home and we'll talk about it in the morning? I mean, could you do that? It's inconceivable. Somebody gives themselves over to you in the most insanely embarrassing way, maintaining no control over the situation, trusting you 100%, and you say, well, I have a few questions, or let's discuss it in the morning. So his whole sense was, I must respond. But that response is a love response. It's a sense of the other person. It's a covet for the other individual. If he starts off the conversation by saying Eved Avram Anochi, he can't possibly say over that part of the story. So he skips all of those issues. It's her, in the end, that asserts the incredible independence of a lady, which is the big change. And it's a slap across the face, right? So what do you say to your wondering whether, you think it's a good idea? Who are you? She says, I'm going. I couldn't care less what your opinion is. Don't bother asking. It's like, whoa. And that's all in that one word. I'm going. It's so powerful, so awesome. In the context of, the family talking to the little girl and doing the yaitz with her and so on. It's amazing.
Was he going that scary man?
Yeah, exactly.
Still he says that when she saw that's what she was still fighting. She fell off the camera, she was still fighting.
Yeah, but it's a totally different phrase. Okay. So that means that what we have here is an Eved who was told, Ein arur mitchaberin baruch. He says, why? And he tells them, I said that. That's what we discovered. He tells them, this is what I said, right? And they invite him in as Bo Baruch Hashem. Now, the very fact, which again strikes us because of Western orientation, that they could use bris milah as a hefza shel kedusha for a Rafayim. I mean, isn't the ultimate idea of bris milah, by definition, the opposite of the Rafayim? As the Shach points out, I mean, my God, the whole idea is you're trying to take a phallus symbol, which comes from the Nachash, and the whole idea of its memshala, its rape orientation, which is purifying, will make it happen, essentially. And you're essentially turning it into an organ which is human and beautiful. Now, that's the whole point. That's why we throw the orla into the offer, as he points out. It only brings many, many riots to that idea. So over here, the last person in the world that you should want to swear on bris milah is Eliezer ben Avram. Right? And clearly, the whole point is that that's exactly the transition that's taking place here. Because not only am I swearing on bris milah, I'm essentially taking over your reproductive facilities. Because I'm going to select your future. I'm going to select where your genes are going to end up. And you're trusting me. Trusting the individual that you feared no end. Ben Meshek Beiti Damesek Eliezer. Hinei Ben Beiti Yoreshoti. The most horrible thing. And you are handing over the future. That's what handing over a penis means. I'm handing over my future to this. And he ends up being totally trustworthy. And that's exactly what he does, and that the Medrash says. So take a look. Make a kal v'chomer for yourself. If a person like this, Eliezer ben Avram, whose entire mitzias is klola, coming back from Cham, the Shemesh and the Teva, the idea all the way back in Gan Eden of Nachash and klola and so on. And because of the fact that he gives himself over b'nei emunos to be Meshamesh Avram Avinu and sticks with his faithfulness, was Yotze Michlal Oror L'Chlal Voroch, and according to the Talmud Ve'Eliyahu, Avram Avinu was actually Mishachrer him, or was it the Pirkei Rebbe Eliezer? Could be. Maybe. Okay, well, you'll take a look in your notes. He was actually Mishachrer, and he became Og Melech HaBashan. He was Zocher to Malchus. This is stunning. This is somebody that Moshe Rabbeinu was afraid of because he had the schus of bris milah in particular. The Zohar says that's what he was afraid of. But that means that there's a very deep transformation in the ultimate vision of what it is to be, to say paternalistic is a little bit too pleasant, in the ultimate vision of rapists, of being able to relate to women as total objects, as pornography. I mean, everything that you mizalzel in today, which people are reduced to being nothing but generic objects that everybody feels is so distasteful and so disgusting. I mean, forget about your religious views. Take such a thing to be able to be mahapich in the course of this parsha is clearly a fundamental transition from the original types of relationships. On their finest level were paternalistic and chamasi alecha. On the worst level were pure victims, victims on every level, victims. I mean, take a look at Daesh today. I mean, you're talking about, God help us. That was the primitive vision of humanity to women. It's frightening. I mean, we read these reports of what women go through with them. How's this possible? It's worse than animals. But that was the situation. So all of that means that transition to actual love is one of the most shocking things. Again, to us, it's not so shocking because we're the beneficiary of thousands of years of such developments. But it's very important to understand what the Parsha is talking about in context of its own development. So this was an amazing change as well. And this leads to the centerpiece of the transition. We're going to have to see all these other transitions, those that we've spoken about and those that follow, how they all lead to the Meta transition. The Meta transition is this. We know that up until the moment of HaChodesh HaZalachem, we are basically within the period that Rabbi Yitzchak defines at the beginning of the Chumash as Korach Ma'aseh Gidla Amalatet Nachabat Goyim. Fine. So what does that mean? So the Ramban explains at great length. This means not that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives Eretz Yisrael to whomever he wishes, because ultimately, remember, Lo Yachmod Ish Et Artzecha means that people come to see your relationship to Eretz Yisrael as being so intimate that it's impossible to conceive of wanting it for myself. You know, you may have very expensive underwear, but I'm not interested in your underwear, you know? No, it's that same sense. This is somebody else's, that's all. Eretz Yisrael is somebody else's. I don't feel comfortable living in somebody else's life and shoes and bathtub or whatever it is. This is your life. That doesn't come because HaKadosh Baruch Hu assigns it. It comes because you see that it's happened, that it became yours, that it reflects you, that it is you, that I would be completely turned off and even thinking that, well, I'll just take it. So that's the ultimate relationship of this change of Sara Ploni LaPloni, right? Would be in this sense. That's what you have to reach. But as the Ramban explains, that development is a development for the human condition. It's not that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't give it as an announcement. Because Ma'asav Yigid L'Amo is the point that the entire story of the Torah, of the Sefer Toldot Adam, we're talking about Toldot, means that you need to see the human condition as part of my separation. Because remember, humanity was the only thing that wasn't completed. Naaseh Adam B'Tzalmenu is a question, and it's an open question. And it's a bleeding question. Is it a good idea or is it not a good idea? And by definition, it has to be a question, because it's the only element of Ma'aser Bereishis that continues within history to evolve itself by taking control of its own evolutions. It's all, as the Ramchal points out, that's the Vayachulu Asher bara Elohim la'asot. This was the Bria for you to do, okay, now do something with it. Which of course begins with Bris Milah, but is part of the whole nature. What does it mean to be a human being? And until now, we've seen all of that. Unbelievable changes. What it meant to be Hanoch, and what it meant to be Noach, and what it meant to be a member of the Asara Dairis that were wiped out with the Mabul, and what it meant to be involved in the war between Avram Avinu and Nimrod, and the concept of what's the future going to hold for us, and so on and so forth. In very primal ways. People looking for identity, that's what they're called, Anshe Hashem, exactly the same as the Raphaim. But we never saw anything about the connection of the last part. We saw Koach Ma'asav Higid La'amot. That's what we saw. So that the Torah gives over not only the evolution of the earth very briefly, in terms of the Sheshis Yimei, but also the evolution of humanity in great detail. This little story, which may seem insignificant to you, but which had massive implications. The first murder, the first responsibility, and so on and so forth. Each thing which to us is part of the human condition, this is what created that human condition. You want to see the development of a particular type of human being, which is Shayat Eretz Yisrael, you'll only understand it through learning these parashas. Okay? But the Eretz Yisrael part, the second part, Latet lahem nachalat goyim. Where's that? That starts here. It's an amazing transition. Until now, we've been talking about the development of people. And from now, we start talking about the different levels of the kinyan of Eretz Yisrael. That's the second part, and that's why this is the first kinyan of Eretz Yisrael, and why it relates so deeply to that Koach Ma'asav, which until now indeed remained completely open-ended. Whew. This is so important. We're going to have to finish this. I just want to mention this one additional point, is that the way in which the Midrashim bring out on Avram Avinu's entry into the Maras HaMachpelah is that it was an entry that brought him into direct conflict with Adam Arishon and Chava. Because Adam said that it's outrageous that you should come here. And that, as the Zohar points out, up until this time, there was no clear-cut definition of Adam as humanity. Which makes sense, but it's not going to be Behi Am. And therefore, there was no kvias of a mokum for Adam himself, as, so to speak, a species individual, who says, how can you come in here and destroy me? Because by your being here, I mean, it's okay, so fine, so you're a human being that made it, you know. So therefore, because you made it, every other human being has to be a stinker. That's what it means. It's an amazing measure. It says, Lama nikra shman nevel, shemenabel et kol klei hashir. The navel is so beautiful that you call it a piece of garbage. Why? Because anything in comparison to it sounds awful. So we give it the name navel. He said, well, how can you do this? A little bit of sensitivity. And Avram has to explain to him that he doesn't understand the point. The point is that everything that I am doing has nothing to do with me as an individual. It has to do with you. So that all of the things that were still left up in the air, unclear, what is it to be human? If I can work that out, what is it to be human, then you can be happy. Because you, with everything that you left up in the air, with all those balls that haven't been caught yet, in the end, if we make that work, it's because of you. It'll end up being your tikkun, not me. I'm not showing anybody up. I'm not an individual who's in competition. And once he was makabel, that says the Zohar, and he had to promise that to only then did Adam allow him in. But what's amazing is that then when he went to bring in Chava, he went to bring in Sara, Chava said, if she comes here, I'm leaving. Amazing story. I am not going to be here with this woman showing me up like this. And there, the response, no, we have to stop. I forgot that watch is so We have to go into that. I'll go over it when we get back. Anyway, we usually do a chazara. So we'll go over this piece. In, quick.